Good evening and welcome to this evening's event. It's supported by the Changing Global Orders project here at the Oxford Martin School, and we're delighted to welcome Professor Fabian Klose. Fabian's going to be speaking on crafting a new global order, the United Nations and international politics in the 1990s. Fabian is Chair of International History and Historical Peace and Conflict Research at the University of Cologne and director of the newly founded, 1-month-old Cologne Center for Advanced Studies in International History and Law. His research focuses on the history of decolonization, international humanitarian law, human rights, and humanitarianism in the 19th and 20th centuries. On the history of human rights and humanitarianism, he has published Human Rights in the Shadow of Colonial Violence, The Wars of Independence in Kenya and Algeria, and that was published in Philadelphia in 2013, and more recently, a book entitled In the Cause of Humanity, A History of Humanitarian Intervention in the Long 19th Century, and that came out with Cambridge in 2022. I can't seem to read 21st century numbers today. You can tell I'm a 20th century historian, so I'm used to things beginning with 19. Fabian, after his talk, will be in discussion with our co-directors, Andy Hurrell. Andy is Senior Research Fellow at Balliol College, having previously been the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford. And the other person in conversation who'll be chairing the discussion is Andy Thompson, who's Professor of Global and Imperial History at Nuffield College. So I leave it to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your kind introduction. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Andrew Hurrell, Louise Fassett, Patricia Clevin, Andrew Thompson, the team of the Changing Global Orders program, and in particular, the Oxford Martin School for inviting me and giving me the wonderful opportunity to spend time here in Oxford over the course of this year. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be an Oxford Martin School Fellow. It has been, and it is still, a very inspiring time for me, especially when you are at the beginning of a new research project, as I am. Allow me to start by looking back at a very special meeting taking place over 30 years ago at the UN headquarters in New York. In the morning of the 31st of January 1992, the British Prime Minister, John Major, opened as president the meeting of the UN Security Council. Major made clear right at the beginning of his speech that this was a unique meeting. For the first time ever, the Security Council met at the level of the heads of state to discuss the responsibility of the Council for security and peace in face of new global challenges. For Major, the meeting marked a historical turning point in the world and at the United Nations, and he asked his colleagues to give the new elected UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali full backing in carrying out his mandate, as the situation in the world needed new ideas and impetus. The British Prime Minister concluded his opening statement by saying, quote, "The world now has the best chance for peace, security, and development since the founding of the United Nations. I hope, like the founders of the United Nations themselves, that we can today renew the resolve enshrined in the Charter, the resolve to combine our efforts to accomplish the aims of the Charter in the interest of all the people we are privileged to represent. That is our role, and I wish the Council well in its work today." End of quote. The following speakers, including among others French President François Mitterrand, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, US President George H.W. Bush, and Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng, all underlined the historic character of this meeting as a turning point for international history at the end of the 20th century. In their speeches, they emphasized various issues they regarded as fundamental for future international politics, such as security, peace, disarmament, development, and human rights. In a time of a world in crisis, when the shape of a new global order was not yet clear, they all endorsed a strong commitment to the principles of the UN Charter. Furthermore, they expected and demanded from the United Nations, in particular from the new UN Secretary General, to take a leading role in finding solutions for these new challenges. Accordingly, in the final comment statement, all members of the Security Council asked Boutros-Ghali to prepare a report on ways of strengthening and making more efficient within the framework and provision of the Charter the capacity of the United Nations for preventive diplomacy, for peacemaking, and for peacekeeping. The Security Council meeting in January 1992 is remarkable. In a time of fundamental change, the leading powers asked the United Nations for taking leadership in crafting a new global order on the basis of the UN Charter, and for taking responsibility to manage the manifold challenges emerging in the post-Cold War world. And these challenges were indeed vast and complex. Despite some enthusiastic interpretation of the end of the Cold War as the beginning of a new prosperous chapter in human history, just to mention Francis Fukuyama's infamous thesis of the end of history, the situation at the beginning of the 1990s looked quite different. The dissolution of the Soviet Union led to an explosion of ethnic conflicts in the Caucasus. In Somalia, the ongoing civil war led to the breakdown of state authority and caused a major humanitarian crisis for the civilian population. In the course of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, 3 severe civil wars were fought, bringing back crimes against humanity to the heart of Europe. In Rwanda, the conflict between Hutus and Tutsis intensified once again, which finally led to the catastrophe of genocide in 1994. In this perspective, the 1990s were not only the decade in which democracy and freedom spread after the end of the Cold War, but also the decade of global shocks in a world in crisis, with the eruption of mass violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. In my lecture, I want to raise the question of how the United Nations reacted to the request of the international community in January 1992. Which kind of visions for strengthening the world organization and making its work more efficient did they develop, and with what kind of consequences? Were they able to assume a role of leadership and take up responsibility in responding to global crises? In other words, I want to explore the role of an international organization such as the United Nations, not as a receiver, but as one of the major makers of a new global order. Doing this, I want to look in a first step at visions of global ordering developed within the UN, and in a second step at its consequences. To finally draw some conclusion about the role of the United Nations in international politics in the 1990s. So let me start with an agenda for peace in a world of crisis. It took the UN Secretary General Boutros-Ghali less than 5 months to prepare his report, which he presented on the 17th of June 1992 as the Agenda for Peace, outlining a new role for the World Organization. In his report, he emphasized the historical dimension of the moment by referring to the founding phase of the United Nations in 1945, and by describing the end of the Cold War as a unique chance to implement the objectives of the UN Charter. I quote, "We have been given a second chance." He's referring to the League of Nations. "We've been given a second chance to create the world of our charter. With the Cold War ended, we have drawn back from the brink of a confrontation that threatened the world and, too often, paralyzed our organization." Unquote. For him, this moment of fundamental change and crisis was a window of opportunity for the World Organization to play a much more prominent and much more active role in international politics. Looking at the steps ahead for crafting the world of our charter, Boutros-Ghali was fully aware that the situation and challenges were quite different than in 1945. In his agenda, he explicitly referred to the new multi-layered and entangled causes of conflict, which went far beyond the traditional notion of war and peace. He identified issues of social and economic underdevelopment, famine, disease, and gross human rights violation as a complex new dimension of insecurity. In order to address these intertwined challenges for peace and security, the UN Secretary General proposed new mechanisms to react, which consisted of 4 central components, namely preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, and peacekeeping, as well as post-conflict peace building. Furthermore, for Boutros-Ghali, it was also the time to rethink fundamental principles such as sovereignty and concepts of peace and security themselves. In his perspective, the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty of states had passed in an ever more interdependent world. It was now the shared responsibility of states, non-governmental organizations, as well as the whole UN system to commonly foster what he described an integrated approach to human security. This meant that preserving international peace and security on the one hand, and protecting human rights and humanitarian needs on the other hand, were now not regarded as different or even rival goals any longer, but as an integrated major common aim of the United Nations. In this respect, the Agenda for Peace could be interpreted as an attempt to reconcile and to integrate various aims of the World Organization since its foundation. It was an attempt to overcome the dualism of absolute sovereignty in the name of peace and security and intervention for human protection, which existed within the UN system since 1945. The Agenda for Peace in a world of crisis was only the starting point in rethinking and redefining the organization's main goals. In March 1994, the United Nations published its Human Development Report, which, since its initial launch in 1990, sought to place the individual human being in the center of international development. This fourth report further aimed at redefining the notion of security. Now, centered on the well-being of people rather than on nation states, the new concept of human security emphasized the links between extreme poverty, armed conflict, climate change, and other threats to human welfare and fundamental human rights. Bringing together the elements of security, of development, and of individual rights, the concept of human security formed now the kind of amalgam of the UN main goals. In achieving these, the Human Development Report, like the Agenda for Peace earlier, strongly argued for a leading role of the United Nations in building up a new world. In the light of these visions full of optimism about a new leadership role for the United Nations, the question arises, did the World Organization use its second chance to build up a world of its charter? Was it able to successfully take up a leadership role to implement a new agenda and to build up a new world? This brings me to my second point, the question of UN leadership in building up a new world. The answer to this question could be given by telling two contradictory stories. One of rapid expansion and accelerated international cooperation, and one of broken promises and catastrophic failures. Looking at the early 1990s, we indeed recognize a veritable explosion of UN intervention in various crises around the world. During this period, the World Organization was more active than ever before in its 45 years history, well illustrated by these exemplary numbers. While between 1948 and 1988 only 15 UN peace missions existed, their number grew significantly to 38 new missions only in the 1990s. Between 1987 and 1994, the number of UN Blue Helmets was raised from 10,000 to 70,000, and the UN peacekeeping budget from $230 million to $3.6 billion. New UN departments, such as the Department of Political Affairs and the Department for Peacekeeping Operation, were created by Boutros-Ghali already in March 1992. Actually, one of his first major decisions after taking office. So at a first glance, this all could be interpreted as the United Nations were actively taking a leadership role in addressing global crises and became a kind of primus inter pares in crisis management. However, if we look closer, this picture is getting blurred and much more ambivalent. The transition from classic Cold War era peacekeeping to a policy in the sense of active humanitarian intervention was often accompanied by setbacks and tensions, and the worst case led to catastrophic failures on the ground. UN Blue Helmets on the spot had to realize, and often in dramatic ways, that the mandate and resources of their missions were completely inadequate to stop gross human rights violations and genocide. The failure of the UN missions in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 1990s illustrates this point with sad clarity. The UN and its locally stationed peacekeeping troops proved unable to prevent neither the genocide of an estimated 800,000 Tutsi by the Hutu compatriots in Rwanda in 1994, nor that of over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims by Serb forces in the so-called safe area declared by the UN around the town of Srebrenica in 1995. Only within a year after proclaiming its concept of human security, the United Nations experienced two of its most dramatic failures to protect the most fundamental human rights. Even the International Commission on Global Governance, founded in 1992 with full support of Boutros-Ghali, commented on this development in its renowned report in 1995 by indicating that during its existence, the world was witnessing brutal violence in Somalia, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and genocide in Rwanda, in combination with total inaction of governments and the United Nations. Thus, the report critically remarked, I quote, "Instead of moving together around a common vision in the way forward, the world seems in danger of losing its way," unquote. Such statements clearly demonstrated that the United Nations were not capable to fulfill the expected leadership role, but rather were losing the second chance to build up the world of its charter. A critical gap became obvious between UN concept for the protection of human security and its practical implementation, for which people in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia had to pay a very high price. When on the occasion of the 50th anniversary year of the foundation of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali presented in 1995 his supplement to the Agenda for Peace, the tone of this report was much less optimistic and clearly shaped by the impression of recent failures. Nevertheless, the UN Secretary concluded in this report, quote, "There is no reason for frustration or pessimism. No more progress has been made in the past few years towards using the United Nations as it was designed to be used that many could have ever predicted. The call to decision should be a call to confidence and courage," unquote. However, instead of encouragement and optimism, this sounded much more like an unintended confession of failure. To conclude, allow me briefly to raise some final aspects. The 1990s have recently become the topic of an increasing historical interest, and some historians have started to characterize this decade as the global interregnum of liberal internationalism. Astonishing enough, in these debates, the UN and its role at the end of the 20th century is quite often marginalized or even completely missing. However, from my perspective, it is fundamental to include international organizations such as the United Nations to analyze international politics during the 1990s, because it helps us to examine internationalism and global governance not just as an idea, but how it worked in practice. What internationalism meant for international politics in this decade, which lasting consequences it had, how it functioned in success and in failure. In a world of crisis, the United Nations mattered as a maker of global orders. In 1992, as I described in my talk, the eyes of the international community turned to the World Organization for leadership. UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali thought to meet this expectation, at the same time to use this momentum as a window of opportunity for the World Organization to play a much bigger and active role in international politics. His Agenda for Peace redefined fundamental principles such as peace, security, sovereignty, and the idea of responsibility, leading to the theoretical concept of human security, and in practice, to a massive expansion of UN intervention in various crises around the world. However, this did not mark the beginning of the world of our charter as Boutros Ghali had hoped for, or to the breakthrough of global human rights, as some historians have put it. Instead, the failures of the UN missions in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia draw a very different picture of a world in which theoretical concepts to protect human security and its practical implementation did not match. Thus, the role of the United Nations in the 1990s is a very ambivalent one, which needs to be critically investigated and not left out of the picture, but placed in the context of international politics of this decade. Having said this, I think it is equally important to keep the broader history of the United Nations in mind and to relate the development of the 1990s to crucial trajectories of the World Organization's history, such as the founding phase in 1945, the era of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s, or the post-colonial period since the 1970s. Already during these periods, fundamental developments were set in motion and later on served as a crucial point of reference for the attempt to craft the world of our charter at the end of the 20th century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just checking, is the mic on? Can you? Yeah, you can hear at the back, can you? So just to let you know what's going to happen in the rest of the time that we have, those of you who are not familiar with many strengths of the Oxford Martin School, it's perhaps worth pointing out that one of them is fidelity to Swiss standards of timekeeping. So we will be finishing promptly on the hour, and Charles is nodding affirmatively at the back as I say that. So we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of dialogue on the stage, and I promise you that we're then going to open up to the floor and encourage your questions. And maybe if I can start with one question for Fabian and then turn to Andy after that. 1990s. Probably, I don't want to be too presumptuous about judging the age of people in the room, but quite a lot of us might have actually lived through the decade and remember it. To what extent is it possible to historicize that decade? You are coming to it as an academic historian. And what does it actually mean to bring the sort of rigor of historical analysis to bring to bear on a decade that many of us will have our own memories of?
Yes, actually, it's the same for me that I working on this new project now about the 1990s and realizing that I actually lived through the period, and I had some memories of this period. So I think it's a new phenomenon. The question I would say you're raising is a very important one, and I would probably have a very short answer. And you're not happy with a very short answer, but there's a longer version of the answer. The short answer would be, this period is now 30 years ago, which is always a good sign for historians because it means the archives are opening up. And the archives are opening up is wonderful for us as historians because this is the essence of our work. We go to archives and now can look at the archives and the archival material and work on this period. The second one, and this is probably the much larger issue, is that I think we should historicize the 1990s in a double sense. And it has something to do with geopolitical turning points. Without doubt, the 1990s are a geopolitical turning point and they are a very special moment, and I try to describe this, and Boutros-Ghali is trying to use this very special moment as an opportunity. But it's not just within the UN, it's also from outside the UN that suddenly people are realizing, well, the UN should play this role. Like the British UN ambassador, Sir David Haney, is saying, well, it's the UN or it's a jungle. Or you see it in the US national security strategy in 1991 and 1993, that even there you find the UN should have this leadership role. So I think we should historicize as historians this period as a decade, as a historical decade. But then I think it's also important, and I mentioned at the end, to relate it to another geopolitical turning point, actually the first one after the end of the Second World War, and that's the 1960s. The end of decolonization, or the high point of decolonization, because also in this turning point, the UN is trying to become a real active player in international politics. Just to mention the Congo mission in 1960, where for the first time the UN is sending in 20,000 blue helmets to the Congo. It starts with a state-building operation. It then becomes an emergency relief operation, and then it moves from defense to a much more offense intervention. I have to be very careful what I'm saying about the Congo because one of the experts is sitting next to me and he knows much more about the Congo. But what is really interesting is that this Congo operation, in a way, the shadow of the Congo operation is hanging over the UN operation in the 1990s. To give you one example, When Boutros-Ghali is in office 2 days, he is receiving a visit from Cyrus Vance, who's coming back from the Balkan, telling him that he has negotiated a ceasefire between Croatian and Serbian forces, and it's now the time that the UN has to move in blue helmets to secure this weak ceasefire. And Boutros-Ghali is very worried. And he's writing this in his memoirs. He's saying, I was very afraid of this because I was afraid of what the Congo mission had done in 1960 to Dag Hammarskjöld and the United Nations. I was afraid that this would the wars in the Balkan do to the United Nations under me in 1992. So I would argue that we not fully understand the 1990s and UN action in the 1990s if we not pay attention to earlier missions, failures, successes. So therefore, I would argue for a double historization of this decade in the sense I've just described.
Andy, an IR theorist, what do the 1990s look like?
Well, on Fabian's first point, it's not just, in a sense, having lived through the 1990s. It's also, in my case, certainly as an academic, having written on many of these things, collective security, human security, UN reform, all of those things. It's very interesting now, in a sense, to be witnessing maybe the second version of the writing of contemporary history as professional historians move into this period, and then to sort of see how much one was wrong, where one was right maybe, but also what that period looks like when you look at it from further back. And if I do that, I guess I have a few thoughts. One is a slight willingness or desire to question this focus from Boutros-Ghali, but also from, in a sense, from you, from choosing the 1990s, that the end of the Cold War is this great turning point, that this really is this new period. And you can look at this in different ways, but even within the UN and the UN system, the re-centralization of power around the United States and the Western world, in a sense, was well underway before the end of the Cold War. And again, for me, it's not the 60s, it's the 70s and the outcome of the 70s, which is really crucial. So the increasing importance or the asserted centrality of the Security Council vis-a-vis the General Assembly, the demise of UNCTAD versus the move to the GATT, the centrality of the financial institutions with very different roles in this post-Cold War world to the role that they had. So all of those ways in which one's thinking about multilateralism, in which the focus was not just the United States and its own proclaimed view of a global liberal order, but also the broader institutional framework. So from that perspective, 1989-90 looks a little less central looking back now than maybe it did at the time. And equally, looking from where we are now at some of the sort of crucial, again, things that are lurking behind many of the ups and downs of what the UN is doing, the position of the United States. It was Madeleine Albright who said, in this period, multilateralism where possible, unilateralism where necessary. So the idea that the core country in the system was in some way particularly committed to the United Nations wasn't true then, it was not true historically, and it certainly isn't true now. So there are continuities both looking back, and there are also kind of continuities looking forward that we want to bear in mind when we think of the 1990s. And then the third point, and I'll stop here, is you outlined brilliantly the elements that are going to go into this moment, the seizing of the second chance of the UN, as Boutros-Ghali put it. But it's also interesting to note the things that aren't there, again, which I think one can trace historically as to why they're out there. Global inequality and dealing with an unequal world of development drops off compared to where it had been historically in the 60s and 70s. It isn't there. Instead, we have a focus on less developed countries, we have a focus on bottom billion, we have a focus on humanitarian disasters, all crucial, but still very interesting to notice in the broader sweep of the UN's preoccupations, the things that weren't there as well as the things that were there in the 1990s. And of course, as we go through, the reaction against that neglect is something that we see coming back now in the arguments about what multilateralism should or should not do.
Thank you. So that's quite a useful segue just to one more question from me, and then I think I'd like to open it up to the audience. But Fabian, you had a phrase in the middle of your talk when you spoke of quite strikingly as the UN seeing itself at least as a maker, not just a receiver of global order. So a sort of activist UN that sees itself as playing some sort of more dynamic and creative role, an actor in its own right in geopolitics. And I know that phrase, which is slightly a phrase of the moment, world or global ordering, is one that you've reached for in your own work, Andy. And I wanted to ask you both of what sort of explanatory force or weight you think it has. And particularly, I think, in a sense of that it's often applied by historians and IR theorists, the idea of global or world ordering to geopolitics. But of course, it can also be applied to global governance as well. What do we see as the pillars or foundations of global governance, whether it be, Fabian, you've mentioned 4 or 5 of them: peacekeeping and peace building, development aid, humanitarian response, human rights. The meaning of these things are not self-evident. Which of these arms that are deployed in response to any given crisis by the UN isn't self-evident either. So to what extent can this idea of global ordering help us to not only try and unpick a geopolitical regime in any given period, but actually give us new ways of thinking about global governance?
I think I would have a recommendation, and the recommendation is to read the verbatim records of the meeting I was talking, the Security Council meeting in January 1992, because at the end I described it briefly, that they all have this idea to give Boutros-Ghali the job now to redefine the principle of the UN Charter and to find new mechanism. But if you read this 15 members of the Security Council, you will find out that they have very different notions. And they are actually picking different things and interpret it in a different way. To give you an example, China is talking about human rights. And it's Li Peng who is involved, heavily involved, to put it mildly, in the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. He's talking about human rights, but not in the sense of political rights, but about development and fighting poverty. So you will find other representatives from the Global South who are putting the emphasis on development, while Western countries, like if you talk about France and François Mitterrand, he's actually in this meeting saying, I can ensure you to deploy 1,000 French soldiers within 48 hours to the UN to do UN missions around the world. So he has a different approach. So I think it's not completely clear what they think about global governance and what they think is the UN Charter. I mean, the UN Charter is there. It has a lot of articles and paragraphs. But then, and I would here argue as a historian, it's also, I mean, there's a lot of very good work done on the emergence of the UN Charter and the development of the UN Charter. And I think we have to be very critical and carefully looking at how this charter developed and how it is interpreted by various actors at various times.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can come up with a kind of complete global ordering answer. I mean, what I can do, what comes to my mind anyway in this discussion, is to think or to relate the enormous expansion that Fabian discussed of the activities and role of the UN against some of the classic arguments that have always been used about why the UN's role is limited in the sort of histories of discussion of different forms of collective security. And you know, there have always been two kinds. One is the kind of the realist answer that that security is never indivisible and interests can never mesh sufficiently together to actually allow an international organization to really operate on things that matter. And that, you know, clearly has consistently underestimated the extent to which there can be real interests, both legitimacy interests, functional interests, cost interests, all sorts of interests in actually using an international institution to do the sorts of things that were happening in the 1990s. But interests don't go away, because as the costs and difficulties of doing the things that the UN was trying to do become more evident, the failures, the weaknesses, and so on, that notion of how much cost for how much benefit, and particularly, does a big state want to do things, or do big states want to do things? Yes, they might get legitimacy gains, but they get tied down, they get bogged down, they get restricted. So that kind of classic, you know, balance of interests, it opens the door, but that door is never fully open. And then the other classic argument on collective security is always power. Collective security sounds good, but it's never collective. Of course, it's people voting, but it's always dependent on one or a very small number of states actually being willing. Now, of course, on your positive side, we see the massive increase in the number of states willing to participate in peacekeeping operations. But certainly at the harder end, that question of which power willing to deploy which forces in support of the UN is something that never goes away. So the collective security aspect, yes, doors open, but how wide those doors open is never really there. And just my other point on the concept, which again, I think looking back, well, actually I thought at the time, but I think even more looking back, is that human security, one can understand it in terms of the way in which the UN and many other people around it wanted to open doors to tie issues together. But just as we look back in earlier phases, both of the UN and the League, we do have to ask whether there was a question, whether there was really an intellectual failure in conceptualizing human security, above all because of the actual difficulties, if not impossibilities, of drawing boundaries. You know, it sounds great to link everything to everything, but can that actually be the basis for effective multilateral action? Or at least, doesn't there have to be a much clearer and stronger sense of decision-making, able to prioritize across the enormous range of things that human security could mean to different people?
I mean, I think that was my point, is, you know, who gets primacy of response. It's time to open up to the audience. Who would like to come first? I think the mic will rove. So we've just got one over here.
Your online question.
I've got some online questions as well.
Hi, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I wanted to hear more or push more about the 90s and chronology, and hear more about what was particularly distinct, not only about the UN's role in global politics, but how would you frame the politics of the UN itself in relationship to the 70s and the 90s, and how it changed in the 1990s? And when would you end the story? So you you kind of spent a lot of time in making the case that there's something distinct about the 90s in the beginning of the 90s. But when would you end the story? I mean, was the end of the 1990s a different chapter in the history of the UN? Or are the early 2000s a continuation of that? I mean, as historians, we never count properly. So would you define the kind of chapter within the history of the UN as a chapter that starts in 89, in 92, like you started? Would you end it in 2001 with 9/11, which would be kind of the traditional way of ending it? Or is this something particular that carries on maybe even until like 2008 or even today with the Gaza crisis? Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent question. I will definitely not declare the end of history, because someone else really famous did this and he failed, I would say. So I'm not declaring the end of a story. You asked me what is different in the 1990s to the 80s and the 70s regarding the UN, and I think what is really different is that they see a window of opportunity. It's not just Boutros-Ghali, also other UN officials, that they want to use this chance to take actively a role in international politics. I presented a couple of exemplary numbers where you really can see the explosion of UN missions. I think this is really different. And also, to quote one of the protagonists, he was not working for the UN, but he was working for a humanitarian organization. I had the chance to meet him at Nuffield College during this fellowship. I was working for a huge humanitarian operation in Somalia, and I asked him about the 1990s, and he said, tell me what is, not mentioning his name, but he's not around, I think. But, I said, so tell me, what is you lived through this, and you were one of the major protagonists of a huge humanitarian operation. What is so special for you about the 1990s? And he said, you know what? At the beginning of the 1990s, we had the chance to fix everything, and then we messed it up. And his explanation was why I messed it up, that humanitarianism suddenly, I mean, he was an actor in the humanitarian sector, that humanitarianism was suddenly so closely linked to the military, that he was talking about military humanitarianism. And then this leads me to the point, where does it end? I mean, I would not say that it ends, the 1990s ends in 2000 or 2001, because, I mean, it's probably ironically that when Kofi Annan wants to present the report on the responsibility to protect, no one listened to it, because the war on terror is, or the terror attacks of 9/11 are taking place, and no one wants to hear about the responsibility to protect. So again, I would say that the link between the military and the humanitarian sector is then overshadowed by all the interventions of the 2000 years, although this would be my answer to this very good question.
Andy, do you want to speak to that, but briefly?
Very quickly. I mean, just to say that phrase, you know, we had that chance and we messed it up. I mean, I actually think that there's a much bigger we involved in that. I think the 1990s was this enormous opportunity that many we's, particularly a Western liberal we, messed up. It was a decade in which the failure to fulfill the claimed promises really sowed the seeds of so many of the difficulties and crises that we came to see. So the problems we saw visibly in the post 9/11, post financial crisis world were problems whose origins and roots lay in the 1990s. And that's one of the reasons why that decade is really so important.
Thank you. Now, we had a number of questions at the back. Could we take one of those at the back, please?
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I thought of two questions and a suggestion. My first question is on the idea of order. You do mention that there's a UN global order in the 90s, something of that sort. Now, whilst listening to you, I was just wondering, what are the pillars on which this idea of order is built on? Is it the Hadley-Boo idea of order, where we are talking about the 5 main institutions, war, diplomacy, international law, etc., or we are talking about the realist idea of order, specifically the Kenneth Ward sort of idea of order? But in any case, if it's the Hadley-Boo sort of order we were talking about in the 90s, but to differ, not so much had changed. The end of the Cold War was not the beginning of a new order. And so I was wondering, what will you define as order and what will you define as era? Because I suspect there's a difference between order and era. And secondly, you do talk about the explosion of missions and peace missions, etc., in the post-Cold War era. But that meeting you're talking about, on the 31st of January meeting you're talking about, in the same meeting, there's a part of that document where Li Pen, I'm not quoting him, but I'm paraphrasing him more on what he said. He said, we should not use human rights as an excuse to interfere in the affairs of other countries. Human rights must be maintained by sovereign nations who know what is right for their members, unquote. So clearly, here was China thinking of a continuity of the world, the Westphalian order after the end of the Cold War. And of course, Russia shared the same idea. Boris Yeltsin shared the same idea. In his own memoir, Boris Yeltsin says, well, Russia still believes in the idea of sovereign rights for all nations. And of course, he did mention that Russia will still have a greater role in the post-Soviet region, et cetera, et cetera. These two countries were obviously thinking about a continuation of the Westphalian order. So what really had changed is the change you are examining.
Can we just wrap? We're going to.
Okay, sure, I'll just wrap up. Is the change we're examining coming from the Western perspective, or it's coming from the perspective of the rest of the world? And where does post-Westphalianism fit in your analysis?
Thank you very much for your questions.
Yeah, there were many terms from international relations, and as a historian, I don't believe in the Westphalian order. I don't believe in this structure. But I would say, when you ask me about where were the pillars of this order, the short answer would be the UN Charter. I mean, the UN Charter they all refer to the UN Charter. But in this meeting, they have different visions of how to interpret this order. And it's interesting that you mentioned Li Peng, and that he's saying human rights should never be excused to interfere in the sovereignty of a country. Actually, Boutros-Ghali and Li Peng meet after the security meeting privately. And Li Peng is trying to explain Boutros-Ghali the value of sovereignty, and that the UN should never interfere within the sovereignty of a nation or sovereign state. And Boutros-Ghali tries to explain, well, we don't have interstate wars, we have internal civil wars, and we have to react. We cannot go on with this. So, and both are not Western. I mean, they are from China, and Boutros-Ghali is Egyptian. So I would say, again, there are different visions of how this order should look like, and probably it's more the plural than the singular, various orders in the sense, and various visions of order.
Did you want to respond?
In a very crude sense, I think you can cluster three ways of answering your order question in relation to this period. At one extreme, obviously some people just say, well, it was US and Western power and nothing else, and everything else was sort of just rhetoric or just language or just a response to what the US wanted. I mean, that clearly massively underplays all that's going on in and around institutions for reasons we heard about. But still says some very important things about the impact that power and the distribution power has in limiting what any institution can do, including what a liberal institution could be. I mean, if there's one lesson that comes out of this period, it's that liberalism, if it hitches its banner to hegemonic or to centered power, is always going to be in trouble. Liberalism needs balanced and dispersed power domestically and globally. Anyway, that's one view. Second view is the multilateralism, the quintessential view, the John Ruggie 1992. It's not just individual institutions, it's institutions that are bound together by certain generalized principles, particularly willingness to operate in a genuinely multilateral way. And interestingly, for Ruggie in 92 and for other people at that time, it doesn't have to be tied with a very strong substantive notion of liberalism. Other people can join for exactly the sort of reasons that Boutros-Ghali was explaining via Fabian about the changing nature of interests and sovereignty and so on. So there's this moment when those certain generalized principles can actually potentially include except that for large parts of the world, what is happening in the 1990s is that their international legal order that the developing world, the post-colonial world, signed up to through the period of decolonization is being thoroughly revised by changes being pushed from the Western world. It's the West that is the great revisionist power in this period, changing the basic principles of international legal order. And then the third picture of order, which we haven't mentioned today, which also says actually it's not really multilateralism and formal institutions, it's all the dense stuff of global governance. That's what's really changing in this period. And actually that still matters for our contemporary discussion, because some people say, well, the formal institutions, WTO, UN, might be in real trouble, but a huge amount of this dense global governance stuff actually just carries on, because it's what really dictates how the world operates.
So we have a battery of questions coming online, and I think I'd better ask at least one of them. So maybe I start with the one that came in first. Cannot disagree with what you said, but could you elaborate on the UN's relations with regional international organizations? I'm thinking in particular of the EU and NATO, as well as ECOWAS. I don't see how the UN can be looked at in isolation, as it assumes a leadership role, but I'm not sure that that role actually existed.
Yeah, that's a very good question. This is also related to the agenda for peace, and also to the supplement that actually in both papers, as far as I remember, there is a strong emphasis that the UN has to cooperate with regional organizations, that it's really necessary to cooperate, but Boutros Ghali is very clear who has the last word, who is the leader, and that's the UN. He's always in the agenda for peace and in the supplement. He's saying we have to cooperate with NATO, with the European Union, but we should always have the last word, and it's a primacy of the UN. This is what he's saying. And, and then we see what is happening. For example, when we think about the Dayton Agreement, it's not the UN anymore. The UN is out of the picture. It's actually NATO who is running the show.
On the basis that it's a brief question and brief answers, we can do one more. This gentleman just on the second row here.
2 seconds, sir.
Would you agree that the peripheral organizations of the UN, such as the WHO and FAO, despite many failings, have been much more successful and useful than the core? And would you also agree that perhaps in the future what we need in organizations like the UN, which I'm somewhat familiar with, is that you need visionary, visionary leaders and goodwill leaders like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore?
Absolutely. I think, I hope I did not tell a story of just failure, because this would be very unfair to all the people of the UN working in this mission and actually also died in this mission. I just wanted to present a picture, not just failure, not just success. It's an ambivalent story of the UN. And I think we have to, if you like the UN or if you don't like the UN, I personally think, it's good that it exists. What is the alternative? But you don't have to like the UN, but I think you should put it in the history. I mean, it should be placed in the history as an ambivalent role in this period. And it's probably a famous quote about the UN. This organization was not prepared to bring you to heaven, but it prevent you from going to hell. And I think this is a very good picture the US ambassador to the UN used in the 1960s, I think.
Andy, final word, briefly.
Very quick final word. When we look beyond the core institutions, the one that actually always fascinates me looking back is UNEP in environment, or at least global environment generally. Because this is the one case where, as against all these other cases, the developing world really maintains its dominant role in pushing the agenda leading up to Rio in '92 and the agenda leading to Kyoto. And so there's a real question about why does environment look so different through this period to what is happening in many other parts of the UN system. And again, one can tell a Kyoto to Paris story, which says this is the period in which the United States particularly then pushes to unravel the sorts of bargains that the developing world has sought to get through Kyoto and earlier, particularly in terms of financial transfers and hard compromises and so on and so forth. So the environment is actually a really interesting one to look back in the 1990s and ask, why does this one look rather different to certain other aspects of the UN system in this period?
So the upside of this Oxford Martin 1 hour format is that we get to hear really interesting speakers on interesting subjects, and the downside is that there are many more questions than can be asked, let alone be answered. So I'm sorry to those of you who had your hands up and didn't get the opportunity to ask a question, but I think we're 1 minute over the mark, so can we thank our speaker, Andy Hurrell.